So, hi everyone. My name is Naseem Rochette. I am the author of The Unexpected Benefits of Being Run Over, and that is literal. My boulder was a big white SUV.
Mm.
So, several years ago, about 7 years ago, on May 21st, 2018, I was hit by a car and run over 3 times. The car hit me, then accelerated and went forward over me, then reversed over me, and then went forward a third time. And when it finally stopped, and I was pinned underneath the car. So the tires went over my head and neck, over my chest, over my legs. The tires went over me. I had 5 sets of tires going over me.
Driven by purpose, fueled by passion. My words got power, my thoughts have action. Motivation, stay gracious. That's greatness. Be audacious. Motivation. Be audacious. Innovation. Be audacious. Inspiration. Be bold. Motivation. Be audacious.
Greetings and salutations. Welcome to the Audacious Living Podcast, a space where we explore what it truly means to live your best audacious life ever. As always, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and I truly appreciate you for choosing to spend moments of your day with me here. Time is precious, and your presence here matters. Now, today's conversation is about healing, not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that integrates it. Think of your life like a piece of handcrafted pottery. When it breaks, you have two choices. You hide the cracks or honor them. In the Japanese art of Kintsugi, broken pottery is repaired with gold, not to disguise the damage, but to highlight it. The cracks become part of the beauty. The story becomes the strength. That's the heart of today's conversation. Healing isn't about pretending the pain never happened. It's about learning how to live fully because it did. It's about understanding that our wounds don't disqualify us. They actually deepen us. Today's guest embodies that truth in a very, very powerful way. Joining me is Naseem Rochette. She's an author, speaker, life coach, and the author of a powerful book, The Unexpected Benefits of Being Run Over. Naseem's life changed in an instant when she was struck and run over by a vehicle, not once, but multiple times. What followed was not just physical recovery, but a profound emotional and spiritual reckoning that reshaped how she viewed pain, purpose, and possibility. Her mission today is simple but very, very profound. It's to help people understand that trauma does not define them, but it can refine them. Through her writing, speaking, and coaching, Naseem helps others reclaim their stories, reconnect with joy, and rebuild their lives with intention and compassion. She doesn't just talk about resilience, she lives it. This episode isn't about tragedy for the sake of storytelling. It's about how pain can become purpose, why vulnerability is not a weakness but connection, how healing is less about getting over it and more about learning to live with it, and how joy can still exist even after devastation. If you ever wondered whether your hardest moments disqualify you from joy, this conversation is definitely for you. So let's get into my conversation with author, speaker, and living example of resilience, Naseem Rochette. Enjoy. Hey, Naseem, thank you for joining me here today on the Audacious Living Podcast. I appreciate you for making the time to be here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. I love living audaciously, or so I hope.
Yeah, I know. Well, I think without question, your journey has kind of been a masterclass in audacious living, and we'll sort of get into that deeper. But certainly, here on this podcast, it is very much about encouraging individuals to live their best audacious life. And a really big part of that living, if you will, is understanding that as I said, life it's a journey, right? We are on a journey, and on that journey, and it's uniquely to yours and as our individual. So what's on my path is mine. What's on yours is yours. And the key in all this is really understanding that on that journey, there may be obstacles, there may be pitfalls, there may be trials, there may be setbacks, all of those things. And it's incumbent on us to find ways to move through that, I have this vision of a boulder as our pathway, right? And we got to find a way to go up, over, around, or through to get to the other side. Because truly, on the other side is kind of where our greatness lies. And so, I think that's sort of what frames how we operate moving forward. We encourage that individuals as best we possibly can, and maybe as a starting point, because you've had your own journey, you've had your own obstacles and pitfalls and boulders, and you're here smiling because you are on the other side of that. You're sharing those to help others. So maybe as a starting point, Naseem, if you could introduce yourself to our audience, talk what you're doing now and the work that's got you to the point that you're at.
Absolutely. So, hi everyone. My name is Naseem Rochette. I am the author of The Unexpected Benefits of Being Run Over, and that is literal. My boulder was a big white SUV.
Mm,
So, several years ago, about 7 years ago, on May 21st, 2018, I was hit by a car and run over three times. The car hit me, then accelerated and went forward over me, then reversed over me, and then went forward a third time. And when it finally stopped, and I was pinned underneath the car. So the tires went over my head and neck, over my chest, over my legs. The tires went over me. I had five sets of tires going over me.
wow,
So,
that's
yeah,
that's and
quite a big boulder.
well, no, it is. It is. The boulder literally ran you over, like literally, and I think though, as I'm listening to you, and the words you said,
I
it makes
know.
total sense. I'm still processing that, right? Like I
I
hear
know.
you, I've heard what you said, and I really appreciate you giving me this time to process it, because that is a really, really a lot. That's a big deal. That's a lot. That's a lot to go through in one moment.
Yeah, it was a lot. And as we're talking about navigating journeys, as I reflect on it now, I actually can feel like it was a positive in my life, as strange as that sounds. So, why don't I tell you a little bit more about what happened that
Yeah,
day,
please.
and then how I've been able to turn that journey around. So, when I woke up that morning, I, certainly wasn't expecting that. But, I woke up that day, feeling really pleased about where my life had come. I was 47 years old at the time of the accident, and I had worked really hard to build a life that I was proud of. And that in itself is a big deal, because
Hmm.
I was a really insecure kid, really uncomfortable with who I was. Took me a long time to, one, accept, that I'm different, that maybe I don't look like other people or think like other people. And then, and there was another, decade or so that it took me of like self-help books and reflection
Sure.
to actually feel good about myself, to not just feel comfortable, but to actually like who I was and feel like, I'm proud of where I am. And so on that day, I had three young kids at the time, three older kids now, my husband, a good job at Microsoft. Life felt like I had gotten it together.
Hmm.
And so, I went off to work, had a really good day at work, was headed home, actually going to go out to dinner with my kids. And we had a brand new babysitter starting that day, so we were taking her out to dinner as well. And my husband was picking me up from the train station. I was walking towards him. It was a beautiful spring day. So, when you also feel like, oh, spring is in the air, and you feel that
Sure.
extra
Sure.
joy and lift. So I was walking towards him, and I saw him catty corner across the street from where I was standing, and it was in
Hmm.
front of a middle school. So I said, hold on. I wanted to be respectful, even though no one was there at the time. I didn't want to just jaywalk in front of the school. So I went over to the first crosswalk. I crossed, and then I was just about 10 feet away from him, and I was in the middle of a second crosswalk when a car turned and was coming towards me.
Okay.
And as the car came towards me, and I'm in 5-inch heels, I'm all decked out for work, and I'm in the middle of a crosswalk. So I yelled as I saw the car coming towards me, and the car hit me. I slammed my hand on the hood, and the car had stopped. And, oddly, I was having such a good day that day that the car stopped and in these moments, I'm sure you've heard everything goes in slow motion. So,
Right.
I'm standing there, the car has hit me, my husband's like a few feet away, and I'm thinking, oh, you're hitting me today. I'm on my way to dinner,
Right.
I've got all
Right.
this stuff to do. I was having a great day. Thinking you're hitting me on this like wonderful day that I'm having. But I'm kind of in my mind not worried about it and almost laughing about it. I'm like, oh, I've been hit by a car. Great party story. Like, oh,
Sure.
yesterday I was hit by a car.
Right. Right.
And then the driver accelerates and she drives over me. And and my husband said it was like monster truck, the car driving over me.
Mm,
Then she reverses over me. And I was screaming, other witnesses were screaming, my husband was screaming. She drove over me a second time. And that second time she drove over me, I actually thought to myself, there's something wrong.
right.
This should still be going on. And through my husband's screams and other screams, I could hear that I was dying. I was being run over by a car. It wasn't pain, but I could see the tires
Right.
running over
Right.
my
Right.
body.
Right.
And in those moments, again, everything's in slow motion. And I started thinking about my life. It was those
Of course.
last,
Of course.
those last moment thoughts. Started thinking about how I don't want to leave my kids, how much I love them.
Mm,
And I wish I had written letters or done things that so on those important days that I wasn't going to be at, they would know the advice I would give them and what I would say. And um, then I also realized, you know what? My kids know how much I love them because we have laughed. And although I've always been a working mom, when I'm with my kids, like I was present, we danced around the kitchen and we sang and we had great vacations and we had beautiful moments. And I thought, you know what? They know who I am. But then I also thought, you know what? My kids know, but do the other people in my life know? Have I told them how impactful they've been? And I felt
mm.
some regret for that. I felt like, there are some things left unsaid.
Yep.
But, as I looked back on my life, I thought, you know what, it's been a pretty good life. And, I was feeling kind of okay. It stinks that it's going to be over, but it's been okay. And then the car drove over me a third time, and I was going to
Mm.
snap back into the moment. And finally, the car stopped. And, as you can imagine, that's when the pain started rushing
Sure.
in.
Sure.
I didn't know what was going on, like if my face had been ripped off, my couldn't move my body. And, it took about 12 minutes for them to lift the car off of me. But finally, they had taken the car off me, they'd taken me to the hospital. And, we had no idea what my, next journey was going to be like.
Right.
Was I going to be paralyzed? Would I be a functioning human? My husband certainly didn't know, my kids didn't know. And it was probably the hardest 90 minutes of their life while I
Yes.
was in the ER getting test after test after test. And as you can imagine, there's a lot more to the details of the story,
Sure.
but
No.
in
No.
the
No.
interest of
Appreciate it.
time, I'm going to give you the big
Yep. Yep. No. I appreciate it.
milestone. So at the end of, that 90 minutes of tests, we found that nothing was broken. I was conscious through the whole journey, but nothing was broken. Even though the car ran over me 3 times, tires ran over me five
Right.
times, I didn't have a single broken bone. My
Wow.
skull wasn't fractured. I mean, I
Okay.
have a
Yep.
traumatic brain injury. The car drove over my head, but I didn't have anything that needed the doctors to admit me into the hospital. So I spent about, just under 24 hours because they had to do stitches all
Of
over my face
course. Of
and my
course.
body. I had to have some eye surgery. I had a stent put in my eye, and I had lots of issues, but 24 hours I was released back home.
It's
And
remarkable.
yeah, it was. And that miracle was also really conflicting for me because I thought, if I'm okay to go home, maybe it wasn't so bad. And all the kindness I was feeling from people around me, like my friends and neighbors that were so worried and wanted to bring me dinners and drive my kids. Did I deserve that? Because I wasn't in the hospital. I didn't break any bones. And so there was this, this conflict of was it real and was it so bad? But at the same time, I couldn't see, I couldn't walk, I couldn't move, I couldn't think. I mean, I really could not think. I mean, I was
Right.
so unrecognizable, not even my iPhone could recognize me. Not that I could even bear the light of a screen.
Right.
Um, but I was so, I say that although I had no broken bones, I was completely broken.
Of
Because
course.
that
Of
woman who
course.
woke up the day before and liked her life, she was nowhere to be found.
Mm, mm, mm. And these moments have incredible ways of altering or changing our perspective very quickly too. And I think that what's I mean, there's so much about your story that my mind's racing even now as we're talking, but there's so much to be said about how these moments can change us,
I
and
know.
and I think the key in it is being mindful of what those changes are, because it could go either positive or negative, right? Based on how you receive. I always talk about life being a collection of experiences. Things happen to us, and those things that happen to us, it helps frame us and helps alter our perspective. It helps guide our decision moving forward. And so it's important to understand that when these things aren't taking place, how we respond to it is really, really important. And I mean,
And
is
you
that fair to
touched
say?
on, something that was actually instrumental to my healing. So,
Hmm.
when after the accident happened and I was struggling in so many different ways,
Yep.
I did start seeing a trauma therapist.
Hmm.
And that therapist taught me about the art and philosophy of Kintsugi, which is taking a broken piece of pottery. It's a Japanese philosophy where you take a broken piece of pottery and you don't glue it back together and hide the seams. You put it back together with a gold inlay so you notice the cracks and you appreciate the cracks. And that was such a game changer for me mentally because look, I had scars all over my face.
Sure,
I
sure.
was, as I said, immobile. I mean, I couldn't lift my arm to hold a cup of coffee. Like, there were so many issues on so many levels. And it was hard for me to admit them to myself, never mind anybody else. And one of the other things I realized is that the accident didn't just happen to me, it happened to everyone that loved me. And so they needed to be a part of the healing and they part of the
Yes,
conversation.
yes.
And I really didn't know how to let them, I think, until I started to really appreciate this idea of kintsugi,
Yeah.
where my talking about my accident and my issues and my challenges
Yep.
didn't have to make me a victim.
No.
This was my journey. And I could talk about it without being a victim.
Right. Right.
And that was so powerful. And I realized just based on the words I use, how I frame it, am I saying like, oh my gosh, I can't move, but no, you know what, I was hit by the car and I can't do this, but this is
Yep.
happening. You know, how I frame, how I used my
Yes.
language
Yes.
makes such a difference.
It
And
does.
um,
No, it does. I'm here smiling, nodding, going yes, 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 because I so am in agreement to that. It's how we respond, how we receive it. Like for me, and you've done this, which I absolutely is beautiful. Is I love when individuals tell their stories. Now, there are some the story ends at the tragedy, and that's all this happened, and that's where the story ends. But for others, including yourself, it's like, yeah, this is what happened. So you acknowledge it, right? So the kintsugi, you see the golden overlay in the broken vase, you see that, right? But you say, okay, that's happened to me. But after that, here's what I did, right?
yeah.
And here's how I got through it. And here's who helped me. And here's the mindset. Here's the book I read. Here's this podcast I checked out, whatever. Like, here are the things I've done. And why that's so powerful is there's someone who's going through their own challenge that you may not know. Like, I guarantee you, there'll be people who are listening that we have no idea the challenge that they're going through. And you're going to hear something and say, oh my gosh, I can do that too. Or, oh, this can help me. And that for me is the most beautiful part of telling our stories because of what it can do after the tragedy.
And that's exactly why I tell my story. And I actually really I learned something really interesting as I started sharing my struggles or my
Hmm.
cracks. I found that everybody around me was going through something,
Yes, yes.
and no, we're I feel like in our society, so often showing that crack, or it seems like a weakness. And I'll tell you, the pre-accident me thought exactly that. If
Mm,
I showed, that I wasn't capable, I was being weak. And what I've now learned is, sharing that vulnerability is actually a dimension of strength because it's not
mm,
just about you, it's about allowing other people to get closer to you, to help you.
yes.
And when you do that, they can share their journeys and then you get to share the victories together.
Gotcha.
I could say to somebody, if they knew that my nerve damage kept me from zipping my sweatshirt, then I got to call them and say, guess what? I zipped my sweatshirt today. Woohoo. But otherwise, if they didn't know where I was starting,
Right,
like, why
right.
is
You're like,
zipping
big
your
deal.
sweatshirt a big deal?
Yeah,
Why is that
yeah.
noteworthy?
Right, right, right,
And
right, right.
sometimes those little things are the proxies other people need in their life because they're
Yes.
they're going through struggles and they don't know how to move forward. One of the things, and look, and I as I tell this story, and I'm laughing and smiling now. I have to be honest, it wasn't, all laughs and
Of
smiles.
course
I was,
not. No.
waking up crying every day for a long time. It was a journey.
Yes, yes,
But
yes.
my family and I made the decision that this was going to be a happy story. And we didn't know exactly how, but we knew we weren't going to let this be, the trauma or the tragedy that demarcated the end of a happy life. It was just going to be a moment in it. And we actually did something that I think has been really meaningful for all of us and for the people in our lives. We coined the day of the accident Unbreakable Day.
Wow.
And so every May 21st, we celebrate. We thank ourselves for what we've been through, what we've navigated. We think about what we've learned, and we thank all the people in our lives that helped us, move forward and appreciate them. And
I
I
love
think
that.
one of the things that is such a lost opportunity when we don't acknowledge the tough moments is we don't get to think about how much we've grown and we don't get to actively celebrate the people that have helped us. And we all, as I said, these accidents, these tough moments, they don't just happen to us. They happen to everyone that loves
Yeah.
us.
Yeah, they do. I love that Unbreakable. That's wonderful. That moment to pause and reflect and to remember and also appreciate is a big part of that. And so I do like that. You talked about the individuals that were part of this, your family and your husband, your children. I want to ask about the driver. I don't know how much you know about, but I mean, the running over three times. I'm not quite sure what was going on for that individual at that point. But the other part about this is because that person's also affected in some way. The level of severity, I don't know, but I mean, I'd imagine they're affected as well, and going maybe through their own trauma, perhaps. But I would also imagine, though, there's a level of forgiveness from you towards that individual.
So you touched on some very interesting things. So, when the accident first happened, I actually held no ill will.
Okay.
You know, this driver did not mean to run over me three times. I mean, clearly some bad decision making, but it wasn't her intent and it wasn't a hit, so she didn't mean to run over me three times. Um, and so I thought, okay, accidents happen, no ill will.
Hmm.
And about 5, 6 weeks after the accident, we got something called a victim's notice. So we went to court. She was going to be at court. My husband was there. So he had seen her, she had seen him. And so we went to the courthouse and, look, I'm walking with a cane and bandaged and, bruises on big sunglasses. And, my husband and
Hmm.
daughter are kind of holding me up. And we see the driver. And there was no acknowledgement, no remorse, no look, no question of how I'm doing. And I was so wounded by that. I say
Hmm.
it pushed me off a cliff. I became very irrational,
Right.
after that moment because I just thought, where's the human kindness? Like,
Yes.
I
Yes.
didn't blame her, but how could she not care?
Hmm.
I expect people to say they're sorry when they hurt you.
Sure, sure.
And
Yep,
even if her lawyer said she can't apologize, is it a look? Is it oh, how, just something? And her lack of, you know, any sort of response to me was very, very difficult.
of
And
course.
we did see her one other time, years later. Her the insurance company was deposing her, and we saw her. And again, I was walking around, shaking hands, introducing myself to everyone. I didn't know she was going to be there, and I saw her, and I did the same. I introduced myself to her and her lawyer, and I thought, maybe she would like squeeze my hand or look at me or something. And again, there was nothing.
Nothing. Mm,
And when she was speaking about it, she was in denial that it
mm.
happened. Like, you know, maybe I wasn't in the crosswalk. I mean, I was in the crosswalk. There were plenty
Right.
of witnesses that, saw me. I was in the crosswalk, and she was saying she couldn't believe that it really happened. And, what I have decided, and this was a decision, is that that is probably her defense mechanism
Hmm.
to get through it. Because as you
Right.
noted, I'm sure there's trauma for her.
Hmm.
And maybe this is how she needs to deal with
That's
it.
right.
Because
Hmm.
and that's okay. I'm not going to dwell on that. I'm going to focus on
Sure.
what I can do, what I can control. And there's so much for me to be grateful about.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and in some ways, it's unfortunate that the acknowledgement that should have been there didn't come the way would have been helpful to you. Um, with the legal, issues around it, admission of guilt, all those sorts of things don't bode well in that space, right? Although that would have been outside of that space, that would have been helpful for you, and I totally get that. But I do believe the manner in which you've received it is very healthy and positive. Those are sorts of things that help us through our healing.
Exactly. It helps us. It helps me to think of it that way. That's a kindness to myself in many ways.
Hmm.
Another thing, which, I also feel is another kindness to myself with the same matter of thinking, is that sometimes in those tough moments, people that you think are going to show up a certain way don't always show up that
Yeah.
way.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
what I've realized is you have no idea what triggers are for people.
Sure.
Maybe people couldn't see me battered and bruised. Maybe people needed me to be their rock and they couldn't see me, broken. And, I'm choosing to decide that, whatever happened in that moment doesn't need to taint all of the other moments I had with
Right.
them
That's
because
right.
we just don't know, what my accident could have been hard for them in ways that I'll never know and they'll maybe never be able to express. But it doesn't mean all of our relationship isn't special, where I can't look back on them with fond memories.
I love the spirit of gratitude and appreciation for what you have. I think again, it's from a it's healthy, but from a healing standpoint, and as you work through your own trauma, those are the things that will help guide you and get you to the place where you need to be. And you've clearly gotten there. And I mean, not that you've gotten there because I believe it's an ongoing process. And I'm sure there's moments where you remember things or things come up, and you put yourself in a situation where you're retelling your story on a regular basis, and I think you're kind of living that trauma each time, although the severity and impact on you isn't to the same degree. You're still kind of going through it, right?
Yeah, when I talk about the actual, like the car running over me,
Yeah.
it's so ridiculous. Like I almost can't help but laugh. Like I was run over 3 times by a car. Like tires went over me 5 times. It just doesn't make sense. When I talk about and when I wrote about, my kids and what it did to them and my
Hmm.
husband and that journey, that's when I start to get emotional. And
Sure.
even now, 7 years later, like that's what really hurts me is what they had to go through. Um, but I mean, that's natural, when people we love are struggling, just as they needed to help me, like you always want to help them too.
Sure. Um, tell me how the book came to be. I mean, I don't think in
Um,
the moment when this happened, oh, I'm gonna write a book. I don't think you get there right away. I'd imagine it was a bit of a process because you now have to. And again, a part of the storytelling we touched on is a part of the storytelling is important. That there's some vulnerability, right? And there's some admissions as to
oh my
what
God.
really like open up the curtain and go, guys, here's what really happened behind this
Oh
thing, right?
yeah. And
So yeah, I'm
I'll
curious
tell
about that
you,
process for you.
I had no desire to write a memoir, tell
Okay,
all about my life. When the accident happened, interestingly, I was in the hospital, and when the doctors and nurses would get the test results and nothing was broken, and test after test of, wow, you don't have this issue or that issue, um, they were saying like, you must have been saved for a reason. You need to pay it forward. And I was there thinking like, I can't open my eyes, I can't move my body. Like, don't talk to me about paying it forward. I'm barely surviving here.
right.
But it planted a seed, and I did know that I wanted this to be a happy story. So when the first Unbreakable Day came, and in that first year and the first few years after, I would send an email to, I'm not big on social media, but I would send an email to all of the people that were in my life and say, thank you again. And here are some things that I learned from my journey. Just wanted to
Mm,
share.
yeah.
And we were celebrating Unbreakable Day. So around the second Unbreakable Day, as we hit COVID, I realized we're almost like in this giant Unbreakable Day. And many of the things that I had learned are probably of value to other people. So, there's a section in my book, the last section called the sermon.
Okay.
And those are my big 10 lessons. And if I could have just published those, I would have, because I really did not want to be sharing a tell-all of my life and my vulnerability. And,
Sure,
uh,
sure.
but I realized if I didn't share all of that context, my lessons would have a lot less value and impact. And so, I wrote probably like two-thirds of the book in a couple of weeks, but then it took me 2 years to finish it because all of the details around my life and my family and what is important for the context and what is gratuitous is really hard. And also what's interesting, like, I didn't, it's hard to know, or at least it was hard for me to figure out what was interesting about my own life.
Okay.
So it did take me a couple of years. And then when I finished it, so I self-published.
Okay.
I didn't even try to get a publisher because honestly, I thought, who's going to read this book? I was trying to write it, so it was good enough that my kids would never be embarrassed in case people did read
Right.
it. But, I had no expectation that people would buy it, or, that it would impact as many lives as it did. And just before it came out, I'd actually given an early copy to a friend's daughter who
Okay.
had a traumatic brain injury, and she was 20 years old, had to drop out of college. And she read it and she said to me, for the first time since my accident, I felt normal. Like
Um,
I might not be the same person I was, and that's okay.
mm,
Someone else understands. She said,
mm.
I am celebrating the anniversary of the accident soon, and I'm going to call it my Unbreakable Day.
Oh man.
And, when I read that, I thought, wow, you know what, maybe this will help a few people. And then, when it won Book of the Year and some other awards, like it was such a surprise. But hearing how it has helped people and actually
Yep.
won awards, not just as a memoir, but as a self-help book, has truly been, such a gift.
To know, yeah, the impact part is what really is what you're speaking to, and I think it's just so powerful, and especially when you go, especially when you go into it, and not with that expectation, right? You didn't go there going, "Hey, I'm gonna do this and this." People, it's no. I just want to tell my story, and if I can help someone along the way, I'm good to do that, and definitely what I'm hearing. So you said there's 10 sermons. Is that I
Oh,
mean,
so the book is in a few different sections. I talk about, my journey of becoming, a happy person that I was,
mhm,
what's happened after the accident. And then the last section of the book is called My Sermon, where I
okay.
talk about, 10 things that I learned that I actually, that I don't want to forget, that I want to remind myself of.
Mm,
Because look, I'm not all of a sudden enlightened and I wake up every day with all this wisdom. I still have to actively practice being that
sure.
person and the person and remember what I learned in that moment.
Yeah. Listen, I can relate to that so much. I mean, there are times I have to remind myself about how important audacity is in my own life. And so it's, there used to be that commercial on TV, the guy at the hair club goes, I'm not just a client, I'm not just a president, I'm a client as well too, right? Like it's like I need, not that I'm talking about hair and bald, but I mean, the point is that we need these things for ourselves too, right? So it's not just that we're staying on this mountain going, here's what you should do to get to the peak where I'm at. Like that peak is always, it's always an ongoing process. And so I'm hearing that. So I'd love if we could maybe identify, one, two, or three things that you can share with people to help them through their own struggles, whether that's getting run over or whatever traumatic situation they're going through. Some kind of suggestions that you'd make?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most important thing to remember is that we own our story. You know, we choose the narrative around our story and the words we choose, the tone of voice, how we interpret it. As you said earlier, like, is this the moment that ends, our story, or is it just a part of it? How do we, how do we think about it? My accident, although, life-changing in so many ways, is part of my journey. It's a crack in my Kintsugi vase that I'm choosing to highlight and to celebrate and to learn from. And it doesn't mean, and I always want to underscore, this doesn't mean hard times were not horrific and horrible.
No.
I had another trauma a few years ago. I lost both of my parents, my dad, and 3 weeks later, my mom. And there's no way to spin that ever being a good
Right.
thing. It's all,
Right.
it was devastating. But I can look at the things that there are things I can celebrate. Like, you know what, I had my parents for 50 years and they lived a really happy life. I can, look at the fact that on that occasion when people brought me dinners and sent me flowers, I could accept their kindness and I could feel their love.
Mm,
Whereas when I had the accident, all of those things were debts in my ledger. I was embarrassed by
right.
people
Right.
being generous and, wanting to help me. I thought that was a weakness. So you can look at those, you really do. And I want to say it over and over again. You choose your story. If you're struggling with how you look at it right now,
Mhm.
phone a friend.
Right.
Ask them to help you reframe it. How do you look at it differently? Get help from whoever it is, whether it's a friend or a life coach or, just think about how do you say it differently? Like, look, and as I said, I'm not perfect at this. I remember the other day thinking, or that, what, I can't, I can't juggle chaos anymore.
Right.
And that's, but I can say that now. I say I can't juggle chaos. However, I'm so much better at, going deeper into something. And I'll share, very honestly that look, I have a traumatic brain injury. I am
Hmm.
now, neurodistinct in so many ways. I never thought like everybody else, but now, there
Right.
are a few other layers to that.
Hmm.
However, my career has actually gotten better because where I used to be able to juggle 100 things, and I thought that was, my superpower of
Right.
solving complex problems and juggling those things. I realized I can, as I said, I can go deeper. I can connect with
Yes.
people in ways I couldn't before. And we're actually solving even tougher problems now because
Wow.
of those foundational changes.
It's funny when you think about the idea or of someone coming to you and saying, this horrific thing's going to make you better. In that moment, you're like, whatever, like, please,
Yeah.
like, what are you talking about? But now being on the other side, you have a very different perspective now, isn't it?
Yeah, but in that moment, you still have the choice to decide, whether or
Yes.
not that is going to be your end or part of your journey.
Hmm.
Maybe like I didn't know how my story was going to be a happy story. I just knew I didn't want it to be the end.
Got you.
And even if you can just do that today, if you're, struggling in a tough moment, that's actually a really big step. And if you can start noticing your daily progress and changes, like how am I a little better than I was yesterday? And look, some
Mm.
days you're just going to wake up and maybe you're going to just cry.
Yep.
But if that's
And
once
that's
in a while,
okay, right? That's part of the
yeah,
journey, right? It's okay.
part of
Like
the journey.
I oftentimes use an analogy to kind of describe the kind of hills and valleys of life. So on the top of the hill, things are great. You're happy. You're feeling fulfilled. You're satisfied. The day you were feeling before the accident, like
Yeah.
that's what that happens at the top of the hill. But then as that journey, because life is a continuum, so as that with journey, you go through those dips, and you're in that valley, and you're not going to feel good. And it doesn't feel okay, and yucky, and disappointment, all the negative stuff. The key, so it's acknowledging that, yeah, I'm in the valley, but how long do you want to stay there? How long before you get to the top of the hill again?
Exactly. And I love that metaphor because, climbing a mountain is a journey. So,
Yes.
as you climb, like look at where you started and celebrate, you know, each peak or, kind of each, what is it, scenic spot
Yes, 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 yes.
along that journey because, and you, as long as you can also recognize you're making progress, it'll give you some hope that you're going to reach the peak. And maybe some days, on that progress, you might like, stick around, take a nap and not feel so great. But
Hmm.
if you can look back and say, well, you know what? I'm not looking so great at this beautiful scenic point, and a month ago I was down there.
Got you, got you. Um, I'm just curious, were there any kind of wild or crazy things that you did to kind of afterwards kind of celebrate life? I don't know, maybe you got a tattoo or you did something
Oh my gosh, yes,
extraordinary.
I've gotten a bunch of tattoos. And that has been really and they're actually reminders for me
Okay, okay, all right.
that I don't want to forget from the
Mm-hmm.
journey.
Oh,
Like
beautiful.
one of them is a dandelion,
Okay.
because I loved dandelions as a kid. I hadn't noticed them in years, and my therapist had said, you need to slow down because I couldn't think fast anymore. And I was taking a walk and I saw, and which, taking a walk in itself was a really big milestone. And I saw a dandelion and I thought, wow, when was the last time I picked up a dandelion and, just blew it and made a wish? It's something so simple, and I wanted to remember that simplicity and the joy of that simplicity. So,
Is,
but wild and crazy
yeah.
things. What else have I done? I mean, to me, writing a book is wild and
Well,
crazy.
I was gonna say, yeah, yeah, because that
It's
wasn't part of the
putting it
plan,
out
right?
there.
That wasn't part of the plan, right? So I can see that.
No,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
wasn't. Oh.
And I mean, speaking, you're on podcasts, you're talking to audiences, you're doing all of that stuff for things that you never
Yeah,
saw
I
part of the
wasn't
journey.
planning on any of that.
Got you, for sure. Curious, is there a word to describe one word to describe your healing journey?
One word to describe my healing journey. Wow. Oh, I think you may have stumped me a little bit. I would say, look, I think it was, this is going to sound strange, but I think it's joy. And
Mm,
not joy, because obviously it was very hard, but it was the belief that joy is still possible.
yeah.
That I like just because I can't see, I can't walk, I can't think, doesn't mean I can't feel joy. There's those aren't, those things aren't mutually exclusive.
I think it's beautiful, and again, you have that benefit of sort of being on the other side. There's an expression I coin every so often where life doesn't always make sense moving forward, but when you can stop and look back, you can see how where all the dots connected, and you can see where you had to go here to get there to do this, right?
Yes. It's definitely all a journey.
Right. Yeah. So you had to, yeah, you had to go through all of those things to sort of get to where you're at, and that's kind of where the appreciation can come from. And so I'm hearing lots and lots of that from you. For listeners that wanted to connect with you directly, or maybe learn more of your story, or where they can get a copy of your book, where could we send them?
So you can get the book on Amazon or really wherever you buy books, and you can read it or you can listen to me. I narrated it too. And then if you want to reach out to me, I do some life coaching as well. You can find me at Naseem Rochette or lifeunbreakable.com.
I love it. I do think the unbreakable spirit. There's so much that can be derived from that. It's so empowering. It's uplifting, and it really just encapsulates the journey that not only that you went through, but we all can go through when situations arise that come up. And so, thank you for that. Congratulations on the work to get you to the point that you're at, because that's what I don't want to minimize how big of a deal that is, to be able to get to the other side and be able to say, okay, guys, I'm up here, but here's who else I can bring up on my journey. And I can help you, and I can show you what I did and how I didn't, what I could have done, or maybe what I could have done better to help you on your own journey. So that's a really big part of that. And I want to acknowledge that. And thank you for the time today and being a guest on the Audacious Living Podcast.
Thank you, Audley. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Back we are here on the podcast. And what struck me most about this conversation was not just the magnitude of what Naseem survived, but the intentionality with which she chose meaning over bitterness. Her story reminds us that healing is not linear. It's layered, it's human, and it's deeply personal. What stayed with me was her idea that we get to choose the narrative, that even when life breaks us open, we still get to decide what grows in those cracks. I was especially moved by her reflection on joy, not as something that waits for everything to be fixed, but something that can coexist with grief. That kind of wisdom only comes from lived experience. And perhaps most powerful, she reminded us that when we share our stories honestly, we don't just heal ourselves, we give others permission to heal too. If today's conversation resonated with you, I encourage you to connect with Naseem directly. Of course, her book, The Unexpected Benefits of Being Run Over, it's available everywhere books are, print and audiobook, which of course, as she pointed out, she narrated herself. So you definitely want to check that out. Her website, lifeunbreakable.com, where she offers coaching and speaks regularly on resilience, healing, and post-traumatic growth, which is so important. And again, her book and her coaching, again, they're just very, very powerful starting points for anyone looking to navigate change and recovery in their own lives. And just like Kintsugi teaches us that cracks in our lives are not flaws to hide. They're stories waiting to be honored. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It absolutely is not that at all. It means learning how to live fully, with the cracks, with the scars, with the strength they give us. Your story matters, your healing matters, and the next chapter in your life is still being written. Thank you for spending this time with us on the Audacious Living Podcast. If this episode moved you, inspired you, reminded you that you're not alone, please share with someone who might need it today. Be sure to follow, like, rate, leave a review for this podcast so we can continue to spread stories that spark courage, connection, and audacity. Until next time, live boldly, live truthfully, and above all, live life audaciously.
Driven by purpose, fueled by passion. My words got power, my thoughts have action. Motivation, stay gracious. That's greatness. Be audacious.